people like Tagore, who was in a sense, you could say, the Rajguru of that movement, the intellectual inspiration for that nationalist movement, always warned us against nationalist arrogance, against jingoism, against thinking we are better, more powerful, more greater than other countries. And one would have thought that India, with that kind of history, would show more understanding, more care, more empathy than, shall we say, superpowers like China, Russia, and America have done. In many of the mistakes we've made in our dealings with our neighbors, there is an instinctive arrogance and a sense of superiority that Indian prime ministers with majorities, large majorities, carry. Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, and Modi. But this has been buttressed by bad advice from foreign policy mandarins, who instead of urging their leaders to rein in and check their hubris, with maybe one or two exceptions, which we may come to, by and large, the foreign policy experts have said, this is our neighborhood.
So as far as these three countries are concerned, and they're amongst our most important neighbors, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, we're not Vishwamitras in their eyes. In their eyes, we're overbearing big brothers. We're people who interfere in their politics. We're people who divide their political parties against each other. And we're people who boast and make them feel small in comparison.
Absolutely.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In recent months, the Modi government has stopped calling India a Vishwaguru and started to refer to the country as a Vishwamitra. But is the term Vishwamitra accurate as a characterization of India's relationship with its neighbors? Or is it seriously mistaken because it masks reality? Those are issues raised by my guest in a recent article for the Calcutta newspaper, The Telegraph. Joining me now to discuss them is the well-known historian, author, and political commentator, Ramachandra Guha. Ram Guha, in a recent article you've written for the Calcutta paper, The Telegraph, you start by pointing out an interesting transition that's taken place in the way the Modi government views India. Last year, at the time of the G20, it used to call the country a Vishwaguru. Now it seems to refer to it as a Vishwamitra. What's your explanation for this transition and change?
Well, before I come to suggesting an explanation, Karan, first, a caveat. So the Modi government or Mr. Modi himself may have very rarely used the term Vishwaguru, but it was widely and ubiquitously used by party workers, ministers, the social media environment supporting Mr. Modi. And it was there everywhere. And I noticed a few months ago that it seems to have been replaced by Vishwamitra, also sometimes called Vishwabandhu, which is, Mitra and Bandhu are, one is a more colloquial word, a more Hindustani word for friend. Mitra is a more formal Sanskritized kind of word. So how did we go from being a teacher to the world to a friend of the world, a friend of everyone in the world? And I think a future historian will have to document this carefully. He'll have to look at language as used in newspapers, in speeches, in social media. But my presumption is that the termination of our G20 presidency had something to do with it, because clearly, blind-eyed Bhaks were under the illusion that India was going to lead the world forever. It's only a rotational presidency. Actually, it was supposed to come to India a year earlier, but we negotiated with Indonesia so that we could, by we, I mean the government negotiated so that Mr. Modi could milk the hosting of the G20 for the next general elections. And after that was done, and some other country took over, then there was a reality check. Joined to that was the fact that our economy was not as robust as claimed. We may have the fifth largest economy in aggregate terms, but in terms of per capita income, we are extremely low in our rank. We have high levels of unemployment. There's a border crisis with China that has been unresolved. The Chinese have clearly encroached on large areas of our territory. So all of this, I think, was a kind of reality check. And of course, after the last election, when Mr. Modi failed, to his surprise, it the surprise of most pollsters, in winning a third successive majority, I think this idea of the Vishwabandhu or the Vishwamitra is getting even more traction.
Now, you point out that India's claims to world leadership are foolish fantasies and that the term Vishwamitra is a distinct downgrading of the Modi regime's ambitions. As you said a moment ago, this is, I take it, a sign that sunlight has broken through and reality has begun to dawn.
So, Karan, again, I'd like to go back a little bit in history. So, the Modi government, in its first and second term, projected the idea of India as a Vishwaguru. But the idea that India would lead the world is not new. The Manmohan Singh government in its first term displayed a similar arrogance and hubris by claiming that India was a coming superpower, that with China, India would dominate the world. And of course, a reality check was provided shortly afterwards. So I've always argued from the time of the first claims to our prospective superpowerdom were made in about 2007 and 8, when there was a spectacle at Davos. It was supposed to be the year of India. And, all our business, political, journalistic elite went there trumpeting the alleged greatness and of our country. I have been arguing since then that we have to attend to our fault lines within our economic, social, institutional, gender, caste fault lines, the deepening environmental crisis we face. And these have always been foolish fantasies. The Manmohan Singh government and the Confederation of Indian Industries projection of India as a superpower in Davos in 2007 was also a foolish fantasy. So, let's be clear about this.
But tell me something. Why are Indian governments so prone to this hubris? Why do they have these, what you call foolish fantasies, whether calling India a superpower, when quite clearly we were nowhere near being a superpower, or believing that we're world leaders and claiming we're Vishwagurus? Why do we become prone to this foolish, almost ridiculous hubris?
So I think, Karan, there's a charitable explanation, which is you must have ambition, you must aim high, and unless you aim high, you won't reach anywhere near it. So there's no harm in, being ambitious for your country and its claim to lead the world. But there's also, I think, a more cynical and perhaps more truthful explanation. That's what power does to you, and power in Delhi. The British, the Mughals thought they would be in Delhi forever. They built all these fabulous, forts and palaces. The British built this imperial city, and in 20 years of building the city, they were out of there. So Delhi separates you from the rest of the country. And if I may say so, it separates not just politicians, it also separates intellectuals and journalists and policy wonks who, because they live in proximity to power, think, have delusions about India's greatness. Come to South India, go to Manipur, go to the West, and you'll have a different vision of what India is all about. So if you are in Lutyens' Delhi, it doesn't matter if you're BJP or Congress, especially if you have a commanding majority in parliament. I think that is true of, not so true of Manmohan Singh, but it's much more true of Modi in his first two terms. I think it's hard to perceive that you have weaknesses, that you have flaws, that you're not all powerful, that you're not destined for greatness. It's the location in Delhi which is the problem.
This is the deception of Delhi. Delhi deceives and misleads people into believing that they're there forever.
And also it increases your sense of self-importance. So as I said, not just politicians, even, thinkers, intellectuals, professors, journalists have an exaggerated sense of their self-importance because they live in Delhi.
Let's for a moment focus on that term Vishwamitra, because the problem is that even as Vishwamitra, it doesn't correctly describe the way Bangladeshi, Sri Lankans, and Nepalis view our country. A recent statement issued by prominent citizens of those three countries says, and I'm quoting, "Over the decades, intervention by New Delhi's political, bureaucratic, and intelligence operatives in Colombo, Dhaka, and Kathmandu has contributed to the unending political instability in our countries and has empowered autocratic regimes." This means, and you point this out, that they view India as an overbearing big brother
Yes.
not a friendly, supportive neighbor, not a Vishwamitra. Can you explain that further?
So I think this statement, which I quoted, is signed by citizens, writers, mostly of these three countries, some of whom I know. And several have studied in India and had great affection and admiration for India. They've been shaped by Indian culture, Indian thought, Indian music, and they have nothing but goodwill for India, for the people of India, for what we may call our soft power, for our culture, for our, what we represent as a flawed democracy, but still a bold experiment in multi-party democracy, which is so rare anywhere in Asia or in Africa. But they see how our government behaves, overbearing, arrogant. They see sometimes how business conglomerates close to governments behave when they travel here. And, they're rightfully upset by it because these are proud, independent countries with rich histories of their own. In the case of Nepal, for example, it was never colonized at all. And that, so they are an enormously self-respecting people. In the case of Bangladesh, you had a successful revolution, admittedly helped by India, against the Pakistanis. And of course, Sri Lanka also is an island with a rich cultural civilizational history and justly cherishes that. And they see our arrogance, our overbearing behavior in terms of our attempts to manipulate their political class, set one party against another. What point I'd like to make here, Karan? You may recall that in my article, I quote a 19th century president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, who's supposed to have said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States of America." And it may be a feature of large, demographically large and economically powerful, relatively powerful countries surrounded by smaller neighbors that they tend to dominate. Like in a school. I mean, both you and I both went to a boarding school. In a boarding school, a big macho fellow tends to dominate the small kid who's not good at studies. He may be good at other things, music, art, literature, doesn't matter. But this kind of urge to dominate that large countries have is visible in how America has treated, Mexico, Guatemala, Salvador, etc. How Russia has, of course, the Ukraine war is a stark example of that, and how India, one hoped that India, because India was born out of an anti-colonial movement. India fought an extraordinary battle, largely through the use of non-violence, against the most powerful imperial power in the world, and won. And the leadership of that movement, not just Gandhi, but people like Tagore, who was, in a sense, you could say, the Rajguru of that movement, the intellectual inspiration for that nationalist movement, always warned us against nationalist arrogance, against jingoism, against thinking we are better, more powerful, more greater than other countries. And one would have thought that India, with that kind of history, would show more understanding, more care, more empathy than, shall we say, superpowers like China, Russia, and America have done.
Let's look at each of those three countries one by one. First, Bangladeshis are suspicious, as you write, of India's intentions largely because of the Modi regime's enthusiastic endorsement of Sheikh Hasina Wajid's autocratic ways. Was this a short-sighted policy, but was it also an insensitive one?
Very much so. And, in my article, I quote the Election Commission of India's shocking endorsement of the alleged freeness and fairness of the last election in Bangladesh. It was blatantly rigged. And, the opposition did not take part. Hasina's party put up dummy candidates claiming to show it was actually a multi-party contest. And the world over, it was widely derided and mocked as rigged. And our election commission went there and gave them a clean sheet. So that was absolutely disgraceful. Then, of course, you have statements by our political leaders. Our Home Minister calling Bangladeshis termites. Our Prime Minister insinuating that they're infiltrators. Now, these are utterly uncalled for. When you want to cultivate good, steady, harmonious relations with your neighbors. One last point. Again, this, and of course, we'll probably return to this later in the conversation. With regard to Bangladesh, I think from very early on, we have wanted, by we, I mean the government of India, or whichever party, the Congress or the BJP, has sort of implied that because India played a vital role in the liberation movement, without the support of the Indian army, Bangladesh would not have won its freedom from Pakistan. The Bangladeshi people must be forever grateful, thankful, even subservient. That's not really a healthy attitude.
In the case of Sri Lanka, you point out that since the IPKF, if not earlier, there's a history of New Delhi's encroachment in its politics. And now, more recently, New Delhi is also pushing Indian business interests. How could we not have known that this would not just upset, it would offend the Sri Lankans?
So I think the IPKF was a mark of Rajiv Gandhi's hubris, not dissimilar to Modi's hubris. He had, I think, almost that so far, if you recall. And his advisors, his clique around him was telling him that he must show his muscle in the neighborhood, and he very ill-advisedly went to gratuitously offer to intervene in the civil war in Sri Lanka after first. Before him, Indira Gandhi had secretly supported, and of course MGR in Tamil Nadu had secretly supported the Tamil Tigers. And then we went and did this. And more recently, of course, we had Mr. Modi's government blatantly promoting the interests of a business group from Gujarat, and being able to do so because a particular political family in Sri Lanka was happy to negotiate this kind of sweetheart deal. So there is, I mean, again, it's unconscionable. We share so much with Sri Lanka. We have the same constitutional history, the same educational history. Again, many Sri Lankan scholars have studied in India. They have done field work in some of the finest anthropologists in Sri Lanka have worked in India. Indians have a long connection, particularly from the south. The connection between Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, the literary, cultural, musical, aesthetic connection, philosophical connection is very, very deep. So to blow all this away, in this kind of unthinking, uncaring, arrogant manner is unconscionable.
And in the case of Nepal, we've imposed blockades, not once, but twice. We've intervened frequently in their politics. And now you point out there is intervention through intelligence agencies and what you describe as Hindutva activists in the RSS. In the case of Nepal, it's pretty blatant intervention by India at multiple levels, isn't it?
Very much so. And also it's often, often even if you, and again, sometimes it's personalized. One example I did not mention in my article for want of space, but maybe relevant to our discussion here, is that when an earthquake happened in 2015 in Nepal, a terrible earthquake happened, the Nepali Prime Minister happened to be overseas. And our Prime Minister boasted on Twitter, which is now X, it was then still called Twitter, boasted that I alerted my neighbor in Nepal about the earthquake. Now, even if this was true, because India has much better scientific and satellite and of course facilities. So maybe we tracked the earthquake before the Nepalis did. Our scientific establishment did so. But should the Prime Minister boast that I told him about what's happening in his country? I mean, what kind of advice is he getting from his diplomats? To behave in this manner. I think in much of this, again, this is probably a subject for a separate discussion. In many of the mistakes we've made in our dealings with our neighbors, there is an instinctive arrogance and a sense of superiority that Indian prime ministers with majorities, large majorities carry. Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, and Modi. But this has been buttressed by bad advice from foreign policy mandarins, who instead of urging their leaders to rein in and check their hubris, with maybe one or two exceptions, which we may come to, by and large, the foreign policy experts have said, this is our neighborhood. Just as Central America is America's neighborhood, just as Eastern Europe is Russia's neighborhood, this is our neighborhood. So we are destined to dominate, rather than warning their leaders who being politicians are prone to arrogance. Instead of checking them, instead of cautioning them, I think a fair amount of blame must accrue to our foreign policy mandarins who have actually encouraged this kind of behavior.
So as far as these three countries are concerned, and they're amongst our most important neighbors, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, we're not Vishwamitras in their eyes. In their eyes, we're overbearing big brothers. We're people who interfere in their politics. We're people who divide their political parties against each other. And we're people who boast and made them feel small in comparison.
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
One of the lessons you have drawn is that in forging better relations with these countries, we must look to cultivating respect and trust not merely among their leaders, but among their citizens as well. In other words, we need a far wider horizon than just the government of the day in Colombo, Dhaka, or Kathmandu.
Yes, correct. You see, I have had the great privilege of being to all these countries, in some cases several times. I also have the great honor of having friends and intellectual and literary colleagues in each of these countries. So I don't go as an official representative of the government. I go as an individual who wants to know the environment in which I live. And as I said earlier in our conversation, Karan, many of the people I meet admire Indian culture, Indian music, Indian sport, exemplary leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and so on. For example, we look at Nepal. Those of your viewers who are interested in books, I would urge them to read the wonderful autobiography of B.P. Koirala, translated into English by Kanakmani Dixit. And it's an account of how he grew up in the shadow of Gandhi and Nehru. He actually went to jail many times in the Indian freedom struggle, along with Jayaprakash Narayan, Lohia, and so on. That was his moral universe. And he went back to Nepal to try and nurture democracy in his home country and liberate it from the tyranny and authoritarian regime of the kings and the rajas. And he talks about how disillusioned he became with India. He says, I was inspired by the Indian freedom struggle, Indian values, the language, the culture, the music. And then I find that the ambassador in Kathmandu treats me, he became prime minister, treats me as if he's the district magistrate and I'm a sarpanch of a village. So that this is the kind of thing he says. This is someone who was nurtured by India, whose entire political and cultural formation was a consequence of working alongside people like Gandhi, Nehru, Jayaprakash. Now, in Sri Lanka too, you'll find similar people. And in the next generation, our generation, or the generation afterwards, they would have been educated in Delhi, in Chennai. In the case of Sri Lankans, they would have, some of them would even have gone to IITs. They would have had professional colleagues. If they were, doctors, lawyers, scientists, they would have had professional Indian colleagues with whom they would have mutually beneficial exchanges. And so they are, you could say, oriented by culture, environment, and temperament to be sympathetic towards India. By and large, they would have a positive view of India, except that then they come up against how our government treats their people and their governments.
In which case, let me ask you this. Do we need to go back to what was once upon a time called the Gujarat Doctrine, a policy where India is willing to give without always looking for something in return, where strategic generosity, if I can coin that phrase, was a deliberate act of policy because it wins support, it wins acceptance?
So, Karan, that would be the right and wise policy vis-a-vis Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and possibly Bhutan and the Maldives too. But the Gujarat Doctrine, though it advocated strategic generosity towards our smaller neighbors, was ambivalent towards Pakistan. I think if you study that doctrine, possibly because of the sentimental attachment that Mr. Gujral had towards West Punjab, where he was himself born and reared. He grew up in a pre-partition era where there was no riots between Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs. He went to a most progressive institution in Lahore, where he had friends like Faiz and so on. So there was a kind of his view of Pakistan, his view of the other neighbors was wise and sensible. His view of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. But his understanding of Nepal, or Pakistan, was somewhat tinged with nostalgia. And I think, as I say briefly in my article, Pakistan and China, we have to bracket. There we have real problems which can't be resolved by being the nice guy, by being the caring, friendly, empathetic guy. But with Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh, certainly, we have to reorient how we behave, how we talk, how we are perceived, and we'll certainly have better relations.
So you're saying that as far as Pakistan and China are concerned, and I'm talking specifically about those two neighbors, the policy of Vishwamitra simply won't work. These are countries which cannot be won over with either friendship or strategic generosity. Here we have different problems that must be addressed very differently.
Yes, I mean, I must say, I've studied our relations with Pakistan much more closely. I've also been to that country several times. I've been to China too, but in China, there's a burden of language. So I've been twice to China, but unless you speak Chinese, you can't really function. Whereas in Pakistan, as you know from your own trips there, Hindustani and English suffice very well. So China is a very complex kettle of fish. There are two large borders. They're disputed. The Chinese have never accepted the McMahon Line. Both countries have deep civilizational histories. Both fought long and bitter anti-colonial battles against the Western powers. Ours non-violent, theirs violent. Both are seeking a space, in the large nations of the world. And the clash is much more complex. And I think I will not say very much about that because I think I can't prescribe an easy solution. With regard to Pakistan, again, at the level of you and me, I mean, you recently wrote a column about going to Pakistan and how warmly you were welcomed there. And I've had the same experience. I have Pakistani friends. The individual Pakistanis I greatly admire. And let me name a couple. The late Asma Jahangi, or today Parvez Hoodboy, who's a scholar and intellectual of extraordinary integrity and courage and a moral compass, which some of our wavering intellectuals would do well to emulate. So there are very individual Pakistanis we can befriend and admire. But the Pakistani state has acted in bad faith towards India right from the time of Jinnah, from the time of the raiders in September 1947, then the raiders in 65, then the Kargil War, and the continual terror attacks in many parts of India, in Bombay, in Delhi, and of course the purging of the Pandits, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the valley, which is a direct, you could say even a plan of Pakistan and, a spillover from their own Islamic radicalism. So we have to be hard-headed. We have to say, no more. These are our borders. We keep our part of Kashmir, you keep your part of Kashmir, and that's it. And I think, so in that sense, with Pakistan, the Pakistani state has, from the time of Jinnah till today, has acted in bad faith towards and has caused untold suffering on ordinary Indians, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, Christian, everyone.
That's the key difference, isn't it, Ram Guha? It's the Chinese state and the Pakistani state, both of which have acted with hostility towards India, with malice, you could say, towards India. That is not true of the state in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. That's the key difference.
So there we have to be hard-headed, realistic, maybe tough and hold our ground. But in these three cases, there is no excuse for our behaving like a big brother.
One last question before I let you go. We can't leave the audience with the impression that the big brother attitude that you spoke about so eloquently, so forcefully, is actually something that's begun by and limited to the Modi government. The truth is, as you pointed out, it certainly goes back to the IPKF and Rajiv Gandhi, but in fact, you could see its roots stretching back even to Jawaharlal Nehru.
Absolutely. So, BP Koirala was disillusioned with Nehru. He became Prime Minister in 59 of Nepal when Nehru was Prime Minister here, and the man he had once admired and worked alongside in the the freedom struggle was now, an overbearing, arrogant bully towards him. And of course, likewise with Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. But also, I'll say something more. Even our states, the political leadership of West Bengal, from Jyoti Basu, I don't know what before Jyoti Basu, but Jyoti Basu and Mamta included, have condescended towards the people of Bangladesh. There's a great deal that West Bengal can learn from Bangladesh in terms of, human development, education, health, civil society. So there's kind of a built-in arrogance among the people of West Bengal. There's also a religious tinge to it. The Hindu Bhadralok condescend to the Muslim working class. So it's something much deeper, and we have to overcome it.
Can I interrupt and say this as a last thought? When you made that and you quoted that story of how the Indian ambassador in Kathmandu behaved like a district magistrate and treated Koirala, who was prime minister, as if he was just the local sarpanch, are we not also saying that this is something that's ingrained in us as people, as Indians? We tend to believe we're superior and better than our neighbors, and
you're right.
allow that superiority to show.
That's a very good point, Karan. So partly it's to do with our caste system, but I think that's a very interesting point. I have to ponder over it more carefully. So partly it's that, but partly also it's who do we want to emulate? We want to be like America, Russia, and China. So once you have superpower ambitions, once you think you're destined to rule the world, you'll at least want to begin by bullying your neighborhood into submission. So if Lyndon Johnson behaves towards the president of Mexico in a certain way, the American ambassador in Mexico City will reproduce that arrogance and condescension and sense of superiority. And similarly here. So I think, yes, but it's interesting what you say. Maybe the caste system also has something to do with it. We think we are the Brahmins of South Asia, shall we say, and the others are the Shudras or the Dalits. Yeah, but I think we really have to rethink this. And I think it's very important for our own good. I'm sure some people who watch this program will be commenting, calling me anti-national, Bangladeshi agent, CIA agent and all that. But that's fine. I'm quite used to that. But I think for our own long-term interests, as has been wisely said, it's a truism of foreign policy. You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors, and you have to live with your neighbors. And now with the threat of climate change, Bangladesh, because of the flooding, you don't know what will happen. Nepal, we share the Himalaya where the glaciers are receding. So we do need collaboration, similarly with Sri Lanka and the ocean. So climate change, the existential crisis posed to humanity and to South Asia by climate change, makes it even more vital that we are good neighbors.
Ram Guha, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, which actually turns the mirror very revealingly on us. And what it reflects about us is pause for us to consider, pause, in fact, for concern. And I thank you, therefore, for opening our eyes to an aspect of ourselves that we haven't really done much focusing upon. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.